When most people think of Easter Island, they think of big stone heads and rolling grassy hills. And for the most part, if you were to visit the island today, that is what you'll see. Today, the island is famous for its mysterious statues, known as moai, which have fascinated people for centuries. But behind the island's beauty lies a tragic and dark history of a once thriving civilization, the collapse of which has puzzled historians up until very recently. For a long time, and made even more popular by Jared Diamond's best-selling book Collapse, historians believe that the civilization living on the island, called the Rapa Nui, came to an end through, as Diamond describes, an era in which the people of Easter Island wiped out their forest, drove their plants and animals to extinction, and saw their complex society spiral into chaos and cannibalism. While this narrative is a compelling yet tragic explanation for how the once thriving Rapa Nui civilization came to an abrupt end, the real history of how and why the Rapa Nui culture fell into disarray and toppled the 900 moai statues of Easter Island is much, much sadder. For early European explorers, there was no greater mystery than the one which they called the riddle of Easter Island. Around the 1700s, the civilization living on the island would soon undergo one of the most dramatic examples of societal and cultural collapses in recorded history. The arrival of Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen to Easter Island in 1722 marked a turning point in the history of the Rapa Nui people. Prior to the arrival of Roggeveen and his crew, the island was a lush, tree-filled utopia with no weapons, and the people lived in peace. However, the arrival of the Dutch and the violence that erupted between them and the islanders had a profound impact on the Rapa Nui culture, resulting in the islanders tearing down their statue gods. Despite popular belief, it wasn't because they resorted to cannibalism or cut down the trees. It, among other reasons, can be seen to stem from the arrival of Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen to the white sandy shores of Easter Island on one morning in 1722. Roggeveen made the first European discovery of Easter Island on Easter Day, April 5th, 1722. In order to tell the story of the tragic events which came next, it is important to first understand the people that lived on the island and the culture which had formed as early as the year 300 AD. The moai statues, which the Rapa Nui people constructed all around their island, as many as 900 of them, were not just ordinary statues, but they were the basis of the Rapa Nui civilization. They were their gods, and generation after generation devoted their lives to the construction and placement of these magnificent monoliths. Prior to European contact, the island was a lush, tree-filled utopia, and each of the 900 statues was seen as a protector of the island and the inhabitants. After each statue was erected, a ceremony was to take place, honoring these stone protectors. At the sight of the three white sails of Jacob Roggeveen's fleet dropping their anchors off the coast of Easter Island on the 5th of April 1722, the people of Easter Island must have felt as if we were to feel if one day we gazed upon the sky and saw a fleet of alien spaceships coming towards us. To the amazement of Roggeveen and his crew, an islander from the crowd which was quickly gathering on the shore decided to row out in a canoe and board the Dutch vessel. He was described as being well-built and tall, with tattoos all over his body. The islander was equally amazed by the Dutch and marveled at their well-built ship. The crew sent him back with 2 strings of blue beads, a small mirror, and a pair of scissors. The following day, more islanders came out to meet the Dutchman. They too admired the Dutch ships and were so bold they stole the hats right off the men's heads and dove back into the ocean. Roggeveen organized a shore party of 134 men. While cautious, the crew was curious about the island, as they could see on shore the huge statues which have since made the island famous. Despite the shore party being well armed, the islanders' harmless curiosity began to frighten the Dutch, who had heard tales of violent indigenous tribal encounters throughout the ongoing colonization of the New World. There is no record of which Dutchman fired the first shot. But not long after the party first set foot on the pristine sandy beaches of Easter Island, the curiosity of the islanders was met with fear, and soon violence erupted. Neither was to know it at the time, but within a matter of seconds, events would unfold that sealed the irreparable and inevitable fate of the once thriving Rapa Nui civilization. After an islander grabbed at one of the Dutchman's muskets, bullets began to instinctively fire into the gathered crowd. 12 lay dead within a matter of minutes, including the brave islander who first rode out to meet the Europeans on that fateful Easter morning. The rifle cracks thundered all over the island, and the billowing of gunpowder smoke filled the air and lungs of the unarmed islanders. While the rest of Roggeveen's time on the island was seemingly peaceful, the events of that morning must have destabilized the Rapa Nui's sense of belief and rocked the very world around them. For a culture that had an incredibly strong tradition of oral history and storytelling, the story of that day must have reverberated down through the generations. The day that the white aliens with their big wooden boats set foot on the shores of Easter Island and murdered their people with cracks of thunder and plumes of smoke, all the while their stone protectors, the moai, did nothing. Imagine how one would feel if the only way of life you ever knew, the construction of these magnificent stone protectors for generation after generation, was proven to be in vain as, at the very first instance of outside aggression, strangers came to their home and murdered their friends and family with what would appear to be magic sticks. The destabilization of the islanders' belief system caused catastrophic damage and undoubtedly led to the societal collapse and eventual toppling of the near 900 moai statues. However, death and destruction aren't all that the Dutchmen left on the island that day. They also brought with them disease. It is unclear exactly which diseases were transmitted that day, but throughout the rest of the uncontacted world, it was very common for diseases such as measles, smallpox, cholera, and even the bubonic plague to wreak deviation upon the unsuspecting Rapa Nui. It is estimated that the population crashed from 3,000 people to a mere couple of hundred. The population may have only just recovered before the next Europeans, a Spanish fleet, were to set foot on the island 48 years later and deliver a whole new dose of invisible death. The islanders would have had no way to know what was happening to them. In fact, if you asked a European at the time, they would not have been able to tell you either. As whole families were wiped from the island as a result of microscopic diseases, the remaining few, small in number they may have been, must have thought to themselves that the giant stone god protectors, which they had so laboriously constructed for hundreds of years, had turned against them. By the time more and more Europeans visited the island in the later stages of the 1700s, bringing new waves of death each time, it is very possible that once looming monoliths on the coast began to instead represent the very death and destruction which they were erected to protect the islanders from. One by one, every single statue on the island was knocked over. By 1789, Easter Island began appearing on many European maps, meaning that anybody with a ship could simply go to the island themselves. For the remaining Rapa Nui, this sealed their doom. In 1805, a ship full of American seal hunters kidnapped 22 islanders to work as slaves aboard their vessel. Later, in the 1860s, nearly 1,500 islanders were taken as slaves back to Peru. Understandably, this caused public outrage, and due to mounting pressure, the islanders were taken back to the island. Of the 1,500 which had been captured and taken to Peru, only 100 were still alive to take the voyage back to their home on Easter Island. A further 85 died on the return journey. Of the dozen or so islanders to make it back home, each of them was infected with smallpox, which ravaged the remaining island population. Within the span of 100 or so years, the civilization which had once harmoniously inhabited Easter Island for 1,400 years came crashing to a devastating end, all stemming from the events which unfolded on one fine morning of Easter Day 1722.